Good evening and welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm Christopher Hawthorne. I'm the architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times, and I'm professor of practice here at Occidental. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the latest event in the Third Los Angeles series. Hosting the Olympics is a bit like getting hit by a car. The question is not whether the experience was positive or negative. It is only about assessing the scale of the damage. So wrote Dave Zirin last year in The Nation in an open letter to the residents of Boston, calling on them to rise up in opposition to the idea of hosting the 2024 Summer Games. Many are saying congratulations to you right now over being chosen as the U.S. Olympic Committee's city of choice to land the 2024 Summer Olympic Games. He wrote, "Don't be grateful, be afraid, be very afraid, then take that fear and channel it into raising hell." As it turned out, the people of Boston did find the idea of hosting those games worrisome, and political opposition there led to Boston bowing out, with Los Angeles, of course, taking its place, which is why we are all here this evening. Zirin went on, "I have covered every Summer Olympics since 2004 in Athens, Greece. In other words, every Olympics since 9/11, when security concerns morphed into turning Olympic sites into police states. At each site, I've seen debt, displacement, and the militarization of space, alongside spikes in police harassment of the most vulnerable citizens. The 2004 Games in Greece brought 50,000 paramilitary troops into the streets and arrived at 200% over budget, the precursor to a debt crisis that plagues the country today. Olympic structures are now used as dilapidated makeshift shelters for the homeless. The Olympic area was described by The Guardian as abandoned Athens. The 2008 Olympics in China displaced 1.5 million people and cost $30 billion. The famed Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing is now a literal bird's nest and good for little else. The 2012 Summer Games in London extended a surveillance state, sent drones into the skies, and put surface-to-air missiles atop residential apartment buildings." And Zirin is not alone in his skepticism. It's shared by many economists, activists, and what seems to be a growing share of the public at large, at least in certain cities around the world. Andrew Zimbalist, an economics professor at Smith College, has said the Olympics tend to be a bad deal, often a truly terrible deal in his view, for host cities for the following three reasons, as he puts it. One, the bidding process is hijacked by private interests. Two, it creates massive overbuilding. Three, there's little evidence that it meaningfully increases tourism. Having covered the architecture and urbanism of the 2008 Olympics in Beijing extensively, first for the New York Times and then in a series of pieces for the Los Angeles Times, I can say that such skepticism was altogether warranted in that case, and that the bird's nest designed by the Swiss firm Herzog & de Meuron and the artist/dissident Ai Weiwei, for all of its architectural appeal, has become the whitest of white elephants. Somehow, however, we have tended to think of the relationship between the Olympics and Los Angeles as a special situation, an exception to the rule, standing apart from all those other depressing examples, and perhaps we're right to think that way. A poll of L.A. residents conducted by Loyola Marymount in February found that 88% supported the idea of hosting the games here in 2024, as opposed to about 40% support in Boston, according to polls there last summer. In a nutshell, that L.A. support flows from two sources, which we'll talk about tonight, from the generally positive and profitable experience of 1984, and the idea that we don't have to build as much to host the games as other cities might. To a certain degree, in addition, we can say that Los Angeles has rescued the Olympic movement not once, but twice. First in 1932, as few, if any, other cities were showing real interest in hosting the Summer Games, and again in 1984, after huge cost overruns in Montreal in 1976 and a major Cold War boycott in 1980, and Moscow had almost derailed the Olympics all over again. And of course, the Soviet bloc returned the favor by refusing to take part in 1984. Why we have that different point of view about the Olympics and whether we're justified in having it is what we're gathered to discuss this evening, with help from a a really remarkable group of speakers and panelists who I will introduce shortly. And there's one more key question we'll be tackling, not just what LA has done for the Olympics, but what the Olympics might do this time around for Los Angeles. Is the 2024 bid an opportunity to accelerate the construction of or leverage new federal contributions to new transit lines, new housing, or the reinvention of the Los Angeles River? I think the extent to which it can do those things will be the extent to which the bid will continue to attract the wide support of the public. The Olympics in Los Angeles is a topic in many ways uniquely suited to the structure and the goals of the Third Los Angeles series. For those of you who are new to the series, and quick show of hands, how many of you are attending a First Third L.A. event? Okay, so a good number of you. And this is also for the panelists. For our discussion, here's a quick primer on the concept that gives shape to this series. We talk a great deal these days about the civic transformation that Los Angeles is going through, investing heavily in public transit and multifamily housing, moving past or trying to move past the single-family house, the lawn, the freeway, those other building blocks of post-war Los Angeles. Mayor Garcetti, I think fittingly, referred recently to the city as experiencing a hinge moment. But in certain ways, it's too simple merely to say that we're moving from point A to point B. To talk about LA's civic character in that way overlooks the fact that many of the elements we're trying and often struggling to add, mass transit, innovative multifamily housing, handsome civic architecture, we actually produced in remarkable quantities in the first few decades of LA's modern existence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So from my point of view and the point of view of the series, it makes more sense to think of three distinct phases of urban life here. The first Los Angeles from about 1880, which is the decade modern Los Angeles is born, through World War II. The second LA, the city of cars and houses that produced all of those cliches that we're familiar with and that the world really is familiar with, from the end of the war to the turn of the century. And finally, the third LA beginning to emerge a decade or so ago, a city trying to establish a post-suburban and more vertical identity, a city whose cultural center of gravity is moving steadily to the east, a city that is majority Latino, growing much more slowly than it has for more than a century, really, a city grappling with the specter of climate change and perhaps for the first time very aware of its limits, environmentally and otherwise. So that's what we mean by three L.A.s, and as you can tell, I think probably from that short introduction, the subject of the Olympics is in many ways ideal for that structure, not just because 1932 is squarely in the middle of First L.A., 1984 squarely in the middle of the second Los Angeles, and the 2024 bid, so clearly an opportunity to introduce this third Los Angeles to the rest of the nation and world. It's also ideal because it's a subject that allows us to look back and look ahead in the same discussion, to grapple with the ways in which the city is changing, how it might look in 2024, while acknowledging the full sweep of our civic history, in this case looking back not just to 1984, but also to the 1932 games, which tend to get such short shrift in discussions of the city and the Olympics, in my experience. And that combination of speculative discussion, how can we shape a more intelligent conversation about where the city is headed, and historical perspective is really at the heart of what we hope the series as a whole can accomplish. And a quick note here about Occidental College's Olympic connections, which are significant, and thanks to Jim Tranquata for some of these details. Bill Henry, Oxy class of 1914, helped organize the 1932 Olympics and served as announcer for each day's events in the Coliseum. The Los Angeles Times sports writer and editor went on to write the first authorized history of the Olympic Games. John Argue, 53, is credited with playing a key role in bringing the 1984 Olympics to Los Angeles as longtime chair of the Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games. It was he who persuaded the IOC to agree to a privately funded Olympics, and he who picked Peter Uberoth to run the games. During those 1984 games, Occidental rented out just about 1,000 beds across campus to Olympic athletes and officials. Oxy's participation in the games began actually back in 1904, Alfonso Bell, class of 1895, and eventual developer of Bel Air, placed second in men's doubles tennis and third in men's singles in the St. Louis Games. Dr. Sammy Lee, class of 43, winner of the men's platform diving competition at 1948 and 52 Olympics, is Oxy's best-known Olympian, the first Asian American male to win a gold medal. Oxy in all has produced 21 Olympic athletes in 8 sports, 7 of whom won a total of 10 medals, which means if Occidental were a country, it would be tied with Pakistan, Tunisia, and Uruguay in medal production. So let me give a couple of quick plugs for the rest of the series. Next week in this room at this time, April 6th, we will be having a conversation that has been organized by the students in my course. I should say that this series of talks is connected to a course I teach here on Wednesday evenings. So some nights we're in a seminar setting, some nights the classroom is here, as is the case tonight. And this year, based on feedback I got from my students last year, I gave my students the task of picking a subject for a panel and organizing it themselves, and they chose the very timely topic of homelessness and the right to the city, and we will have a discussion on that topic next Wednesday with speakers including Elisa Orduña, who's Mayor Garcetti's newly appointed advisor on homelessness policy, Professor Peter Dreyer from here at Occidental, and others. April 20th up in San Francisco and the 27th back here at Occidental, we'll be discussing in a co-presentation with SPUR, the San Francisco Planning and Urban Planning nonprofit. We'll be discussing the relationship between emerging technologies and urban form in a conversation called City on Demand. That conversation, the one here at Oxy on April 27, will include Emily Castor of Lyft, Ashley Hand, who's the Transportation Technology Strategist Fellow at the L.A. Department of Transportation, and the writers Maria Bustillos, Allison Arief, and Matt Buchanan. So please join us for that if you would like to. Let me give you a quick sense of the structure of the conversation this evening. We'll hear first from Frank Gudis on the 1932 games and the history of the Coliseum. He'll show a few images, and then he and I will sit down to talk about those Olympics in the Los Angeles of the 1920s and 30s. Then I'll introduce our second speaker, Catherine Gudis, to talk a bit about the design strategy for the 84 Summer Games. She'll be followed by Bill Hanway of AECOM, the leader of the design team working on the 2024 bid, to talk about the vision of LA 2024. And then Professors Gudis and Gudis will join Bill Hanway and our final guest, Renata Simrel, the president and CEO of the LA 84 Foundation, for a conversation of roughly half an hour on this special relationship, to borrow that phrase that we often use to describe U.S. and Britain, between the Olympics and the city of Los Angeles. So let me introduce our first speaker. Frank Gudis is visiting associate professor at Columbia University. Last year, he was on this campus as the Ray Billington Professor in American History at Occidental. It's a joint appointment between Oxy and the Huntington Library. He specializes in sport history, urban history, and the history of the African diaspora in the Americas. He's the author of Forging Diaspora, Afro-Cubans and African Americans in a World of Empire and Jim Crow. And most important for our purposes this evening, is currently at work on Assembly in the Fragmented City, a history of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Frank.
Good evening. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me. This feels very high. I'm not as tall as Chris. I want to thank Chris for inviting me to participate in this event. I came to a Third L.A. panel last year. It was a wonderful conversation on Mike Davis's City of Courts, and I was really impressed and inspired by that dialogue we had that evening. I want to thank Rebecca Stolz for not only fixing the mic here, but handling all the logistics. Last year, when I was here at Oxy at the Huntington Library, it was a transformational year in my career. As Chris said, I had been working on Caribbean and Cuban history, and I was looking for a project on sport and U.S. Urban history, prompted by some of these political questions that Chris alluded to in his opening, from Dave Zirin's critiques of mega events and what does sport mean in our society. And I stumbled on an extraordinary history of sport and society in this city, Hence, that's why I'm working on this, this project, this history of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. So Mark McGwire, the home run king who stirred hearts in 1998 when he won the home run championship, when he was quizzed by the U.S. Congress in 2005 on the prevalence of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball, he told Congress, I am not here to talk about the past, only the future. Well, my job here is to talk about the past and maybe say something about the present and future. Because I do think the past has a lot to say about L.A.'s potential Olympic futures. So I start with this image because if there's one takeaway from my opening remarks, it's this. If there's a lasting imprint from the 1932 Olympic Games for this city, it is this iconic building, the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum with the Olympic rings there at the center arch, the main entrance to the stadium. Okay? And for me, the Coliseum it is this quintessential First L.A. institution, right? It is built in that period. It is centrally located. It has this fascinating history of public convergence, public culture, something we often don't associate with Los Angeles. And I'm sort of trying to argue here that it is the 32 Olympics that actually sets that in motion and transforms this city. Now, historians of Los Angeles have highlighted the role of the booster elite in the evolution, the shaping of the city in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm not going to revise that history here tonight. I am going to highlight the role of this person right here, William May Garland, and his centrality really to the coming of the Olympics to Los Angeles in 1932. Real estate baron, born in Maine, comes to L.A. in the 1890s, makes a fortune in real estate. He's got a passion for sports, and he's one of these boosters that's civically minded, and he's convinced that the Olympics will play a powerful role in the branding, really, of Los Angeles and the making of Los Angeles as an international city, as a national power. He goes to Antwerp in 1920 to see fellow Angelino Charlie Paddock run in the 1920 Olympics. He finagles his way into a meeting with the International Olympic Committee. He meets with Baron de Coubertin, and eventually he's able to secure the bid for the Olympics. A very long story that I'm making very short here. And he's got plans for a new stadium with him in 1920 before there's any real serious discussion about a stadium in this city. He shows it to the IOC, they're convinced, and the bid is awarded for the 32 games to Los Angeles. And here is the centerpiece of the 32 Olympics, the stage of the Olympics, the Coliseum under construction in 1921-22. There is the iconic peristyle already erected there, you see. The building was built in a pre-existing gravel pit in Exposition Park in South Central Los Angeles. There had been motives to build the stadium to commemorate the veterans who had served in World War I. There was already an active debate around that, a desire for a stadium to commemorate the veterans. But it really is Garland and the Community Development Association that really champions this cause. And they are able to, they have the political clout, the economic power to basically get the stadium built. It is opened in 1923. It is renovated again and expanded for the 32 Olympics in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And here is the distinguished alum of Occidental College, Bill Henry, pointing to one of the renovations for the 32 games, the reconfiguration of the peristyle and the installation of the scoreboard. And you don't see here the iconic torch that is the symbol, one of the symbols of the Olympic movement. All right? So it is the Coliseum, right, that really plays a key role in bringing the Olympics to Los Angeles, right? It housed 105,000 people at the time. It is able to house the largest audiences for the Olympics. No Olympic stadium before that was that big. It has a profound impact on the staging of the games. Now, there's an assortment of ephemera and imagery that I could pull from very easily from the internet, including maps like this. This was a tourist map produced by the Union Oil Company. Commercialism was very much part of the staging of the 32 games. And this gives you a sense of some of the major venues for the Olympics, for the 32 Olympics. With the Olympic Stadium in the middle, the Olympic Village, which I'll talk about in a second, which is a key part of the stage of the Olympics. The rowing course in Long Beach, which was one of the new venues constructed for the games. And then things like the Riviera Equestrian Sport Country Club, where the equestrian sports were staged, although I learned that they were also staged from Vernada at the Coliseum as well this evening. There's always something new to learn. This is a better map that gives you a sense of exactly the sites of the competitions. I've mentioned the Long Beach rowing course. You'll see the Olympic Park in the middle. The Olympic Auditorium was already there. It was opened in 1924. The Rose Bowl in Pasadena, another iconic sporting venue, housed the cycling competitions. The LAPD's rifle range in Elysian Park housed the shooting competitions, right? And so you see here the Olympic Committee using multiple venues. Many of them had already existed or were reconfigured. Very few venues were constructed newly for the 32 games, although you could argue that the Coliseum was, but nonetheless it did exist before the games were the 32 games. One facility that was constructed for the 32 games was the Olympic Village. Part of the anxieties about the 32 games, Chris had mentioned earlier, there was serious doubts about what the Olympics might mean for Los Angeles or any Olympic city today. There was serious doubts about the Olympics being pulled off in 1932 because, of course, this is the moment of the Great Depression, and tremendous anxieties about being able to pull the games off. And one of the things that Garland and the Olympic Committee is able to do is create this innovation from the 32 games, the notion of the Olympic Village, which is very much part of the Olympic movement since then. This is the first time the Olympic Village was constructed for the games. It was designed to house all the young male athletes from all over the world in Baldwin Hills. Essentially, they build 300 acres of housing, what they call cottages, were more like barracks. That were built for the athletes. The women athletes, 126 women athletes, were housed at the Chapman Park Hotel just west of downtown. But this is a major part of the bid. They're able to feed and house the athletes for $2 a day. It's something that really sells well with the IOC. It's something that the Olympic Committee is using to sort of, as part of its branding of the Olympics, as part of its tourism, right? It's a tourist site, people coming, visiting, seeing the athletes work out. And it is an extraordinary innovation of the 32 games. It is a quintessential temporary facility. It's built for the games, and it's tore down right afterwards in subsequent weeks. Parts of the homes were sold, and this is really an example of Norman Klein's history of forgetting. There is no evidence of the Olympic Village in Baldwin Hills today, unless there may be something that I've overlooked. But in general, it's something that's a temporary facility, but it is extremely important in terms of making the Olympics affordable for the housing of the athletes, which is something that many nations were anxious about before they decided to send their athletes to Los Angeles. It is July 30th, 1932, the day of the opening ceremonies of the 1932 Olympics. 105,000 people packed into the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. I thought it would be apt if we heard from a distinguished Oxy alum, Bill Henry, who, as Chris said earlier, was the announcer of the games. And this is a brief clip that gives you a sense of the scene on that day, that typical Southern California sunny day.
On July 30th, 1932, the gods smiled on Los Angeles. Into the measureless azure vault of the heavens, the sun, a golden ball, pushed slowly and majestically as though the great Zeus himself were riding in his shining chariot from his home on Mount Olympus. Within the amphitheater, there is not a vacant seat. The waterfall of color created by the rainbow-hued clothing of 100,000 people spills down the sides of the great bowl from its flag-draped rim to the emerald green turf of the athletic field, with its ivory ribbon of track and geometrically outlined runways and jumping pits. It is 2:30, the hour set for the opening of the 10th Olympiad. 100,000 pairs of eyes turn toward the graceful arches of the peristyle. Vice President Curtis of the United States is arriving to officially open the games. To hear Count Valle-Latour introduce him to the members of the International Olympic Committee.
We're not going to hear from Valle-Latour or anybody else. We don't have time. This was a wonderful find right here in your special collections at the Occidental Library. There's a series of audio clips promoting the 32 games, clips of actual broadcasts. And Bill Henry is a central figure in the 32 Olympics. He's a technical director, essentially, of stadium operations. Here he is looking over some of the programs and the many, many programs and swag that were produced by the 10th Olympic Committee of 1932. And so as I end my preliminary remarks, I mean, one of the things that debates on the Olympics often forget, and I would include Zyron's critique here, is what makes this happen are the stirring performances of the athletes. What goes on in the stadium itself, right? So much of what we're concerned about is what happens outside the stadium or the stage of the Olympics. And it is performances like Eddie Tolan's winning 2 gold medals, the first African-American to win gold medals in the Olympics in 1932. There were Ralph Metcalfe. He barely beats him in the 100 meters, right? This is a foundational moment for Tom Bradley. He sneaks into the Coliseum. He's inspired to become a track star himself through watching Tolan run at the 32 games. Mildred Bay Diedrichson, a foundational figure in women's athletics, wins 3 medals, 2 gold and 1 silver at the 32 games. This is stuff that Olympic historians will tell you easily available from other folks, right? So there are these extraordinary performances among many, many others that happen on that particular day. But really the takeaway for me right now is this First L.A. institution, publicly managed throughout most of its history, public accessible in South Central Los Angeles, accessible to transit even now. It plays a critical role in the evolution of the city, not just for sports, but really in the political and the cultural life of the city, right? One of the things that's fascinating to me is, yes, it is the home field of the USC Trojans, and the now returning Los Angeles Rams. Another great story we could talk about, not tonight probably. The Dodgers, when they come to L.A., they first play in this very imperfect baseball stadium, the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, right? But this is what I want to talk about, right? JFK's acceptance speech at the 1960 Democratic Convention, the civic culture that's embedded in that building, profound, not just for national reasons, really, but also this is the Billy Graham Crusade. The largest audience at the Coliseum attended the Billy Graham Crusade in 1963. But it is things like this, civil rights rallies, Dr. King speaking in the height of the civil rights movement in 1964, right? In the midst of, this was organized by the Western branch of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? In the Coliseum. The 1981 rally of the naturalization of 10,000 new U.S. citizens, many of them of Asian or Latino descent, happens in the Coliseum, right? So there's this fascinating, fascinating history of concerts, of congregation, of public culture, of marginalized communities claiming space, right? Making Los Angeles their own in this building. And ironically, it was produced by a building that was built by boosters for booster and capitalist concerns, for sure, but it has this other alternate history that is worth talking about, and I would argue preserving. So that's where I'll stop right now. Thank you.
So just a couple of questions, Frank, before we move to Kathy and hear about 1984. How did you decide to focus the research on this one building to tell the story of Los Angeles at this moment through the Coliseum, through one piece of architecture?
You know, I'm not an Angelino. I'm an East Coast cat. But I've been a sport head and an observer of Los Angeles from afar for many, many years. And on a hunch, I decided to just come out here a couple years ago and see what was here. And I went to Exposition Park one day. It was not a game day. It was just a regular day. I paid the $5 to pay to park my car. And what I saw in that moment astounded me. I saw an African-American man running a dog training, pit bull training class for free right outside the peristyle, right? And he's yelling instructions, making sure that the dog owners who are trying to control their pit bulls or keep their pit bulls in line. To the right are the young people and other Angelinos going to the museums. And to the left, a Central American religious revival meeting at the now defunct Sports Arena, right? And that was not a game day, had nothing to do with sports. But what we saw was Angelino diversity congregating publicly in that space, right? And so for me, I mean, as I did the research, I saw that history of convergence over and over again. And that's how I wound up working on it. I mean, the idea was that it was just going to be a small little case study. But the history is too rich and too profound. It deserves its own book.
And you mentioned Norman Klein, whose book about the mistreatment of L.A.'s architectural and cultural history is called The History of Forgetting. Certainly this is not a city that's well known for taking good care of its architectural heritage. And also important, really foundational sports architecture has been has been taken down in other cities. Boston Garden is not the same Boston Garden. Yankee Stadium has been rebuilt. What is it in this city about the Coliseum that has given it that kind of staying power, that kind of stature?
All right, so it's a national landmark, it's a state landmark. So it has that status, so there's a preservationist component that governs its usage and its renovation. But what's so striking in the history and the archival work that I've seen over and over again is this tremendous investment, public investment. Because it's not, even though it is now sort of managed by USC, it is not a building that's really associated with one team, right? It has, I mean, the history of Southern California sports, everything comes out of the Coliseum. Every team that comes here plays there first, right? They eventually leave and they go to Inglewood or Orange County or the Staples Center or wherever they wind up going. But it is sort of the history of the robust Southern California sports, professional, high school, collegiate. It is a space of inclusion, and I think part of that investment is, while this is a city defined, as Robert Fogelson argued a long time ago, by decentralization, you are encountering a history of relative social inclusion there. And I do think that there's something to be said for that.
And it does give a special power to those few buildings that play that role. So I think Dodger Stadium plays that role, Hollywood Bowl. I think that's part of the power of Disney Concert Hall, is that it's a place that has a kind of democratic spirit. And Frank Gehry designed it to be that kind of building. There are no suites, there are no boxes. You look across and you see not just the orchestra, but you see fellow Angelinos across the way. And obviously the Coliseum has played that kind of role. So there are only a small handful of buildings that really operate that way in a city that's really, in some ways, starved for that kind of public space. And that maybe that gives an outsized importance to the ones that operate that way.
You're mentioning the design, as you would as an architectural critic. The peristyle is central, right? It is this commemorative space, not just for sports, but there's a history of Los Angeles there. It could be a lot more gender inclusive in its memorializations, but nonetheless, you really see the history of the city in the peristyle. Yeah.
And you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but can you describe the kind of political context of the discussions about the Olympics in Los Angeles in the 20s? Before the Depression hits, let's say, and there's a kind of conversation about what role the Coliseum might play, what role, it's really a city trying to establish itself on a global stage, right? How is that conversation playing out in terms of what the Olympics could mean for Los Angeles, what the risks are, what the anxieties are connected to it?
Yeah, I think at the time there's a general consensus for bringing the Olympics. The details is where the debates come in, and in some ways it's sort of a typical story of interest groups lobbying the state to use public resources for certainly a public and a private entity. In this case, it's a community development association, the Booster Group, right? So there's a lot of debates about the construction or the financing of the building, but there really is a fair consensus about bringing the Olympics to the city, right? And I do think that's part of the success. I mean, they are able to kind of mobilize people. Nameless, faceless people, or nameless people who are building the building, right? I mean, we don't even know who those people were, right? I think we see this again in '84. There is this sort of galvanizing effect that it does have, and given that it's early in the history of the Olympic Games, some of the skepticism and the criticism that the '84 folks wind up confronting is not, it's not evident in the same way. There's an enthusiastic response, I think, from the Angelino public.
And aside from the Coliseum, of course, what is the other built legacy of those games when folks go out into the city and think about the effect that 32 had on Los Angeles? What ways can they see that legacy in built form?
So yes, I beat down the Coliseum drum. So that's number one. Right next to it is the swimming stadium, which is now the John Argue Swimming Stadium, which is now a publicly accessible swim facility for youth and for everybody else in the city. The rechristening of 10th Street as Olympic Boulevard is another example of the legacy of the games.
The 10th Olympiad, right?
For the 10th Olympiad.
I just learned that fairly recently, actually. I lived in L.A. for a long time without knowing that was that. I knew it was from 32. I didn't know they had chosen 10th Street because it
was the 10th Olympiad.
Yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, Baldwin, the Olympic Village is demolished, and there's no evidence of that at all. I mean, that fits very well into Klein's sort of history of forgetting. But I would say it is this intangible Southern California sporting culture that I do think the Olympics help set in motion. I mean, certainly people are playing sports at the collegiate level and at the secondary level before that. But I think part of the reason why LA is an Olympic city is that it does have this
robust, amateur, professional sporting culture that I think has been historically a force for inclusion. And to me, that is one of the legacies that you don't see in the built environment, but you do see in congregating spaces throughout the region.
And unlike 84 and how we imagine 2024, this is a city that, not just in terms of the Olympics, it's building everything. Every civic institution, every college campus, every kind of public body is being invented and being built. And I think that's one, that obviously sets the stage for a city that can be more adaptable when it comes to absorbing a new Olympics. But at that moment, it's interesting to think of it in that framework of a city that is, every institution is sort of being invented and introduced to the public and the rest of the world.
Yeah, and you're seeing the seeds of the second L.A. in the stage of the games too. The anxieties about traffic, the widening of Wilshire Boulevard is happening in the 1920s, right? So now we've got a debate about the metro expanding into Westwood, right? But now you're seeing in that moment, right, the sort of the growing hegemony of the automobile, right? And so even though part of what makes the Coliseum and that Olympic Park unique is its central location, right? But you are seeing the seeds of the problems later on emerging, even in the staging of those games.
Final question for you, and we'll hear a little bit of about this from Bill Hanway, of course, but what's your sense about the adaptability of the Coliseum, first for the Rams temporarily, and then for the potential of hosting another Olympics here in 2024? How much, we have some changes coming sponsored by USC, but we may have some other changes required to please the IOC.
Yeah, no, that's going to be really fascinating. When I decided to write this book, none of that had happened. So I'm kind of glad that it has happened. I mean, there's something poetic about the Rams coming back to South Central Los Angeles, because they left South Central Los Angeles precisely because it was in South Central Los Angeles. There was all sorts of anxieties about the neighborhood and, of course, the lack of suites and that sort of stuff in the 70s, right? So here they are. They want to come back, and they want to build this mega stadium in Inglewood, but they've got to go back to South Los Angeles, right? So yes, I mean, my sense is that there's a reconfiguring, not just for the Olympics, but for the NFL. They have their own sort of mandates for NFL-ready stadium. And I suppose that those debates are still going on right now. But I think that it would be tragic, I would say, if the Coliseum, even if it's not housing an Olympic event, given its centrality to the history of the movement and the movement of its city. So, I mean, now, what is fascinating is that this is a building that has resisted the amenities of the neoliberal stadium, right? And so inevitably, the amenities mean the luxury box and et cetera and so on, right? So inevitably, that has to be worked out. I suspect it is being worked out or debated about. And so that's really the fascinating question, right? How is this building, which by design is a single-tier facility without luxury boxes, without many of the amenities that we associate with contemporary stadiums, how is that going to be repurposed? It seems to me that it could be repurposed, and it should be repurposed.
Terrific. All right, let's zoom forward to 1984, and I'll introduce Kathy Gudis from here before Frank and I take our seats to hear about 1984. Catherine Gudis, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Public History Program at UC Riverside, where she teaches classes in public history and 20th century U.S. history, building on her twin interests in modern consumer culture and cultural and urban constructions of race, space, and place. So some overlap with the work that Frank is doing. Current research towards her next book, tentatively titled Curating the City, The Framing of Los Angeles, explores the way in which public art, performance, and history can help frame and socially activate urban space and place in Southern California. And she's also here because she does a lot of work as a curator, and she was one of the curators of a terrific show called Deborah Sussman Loves Los Angeles that was at the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urbanism's WUHO Gallery in 2014, and that's connected to what she's going to talk about right now, which is the design strategy for the 1984 Summer Olympics. Kathy.
Thank you so much for having me here and for really support of this incredible set of programs of Third L.A. So I'm going to try to talk about the look of what was called the Spartan Olympics. And I'm going to do so through the lens of the design. So I admit I know not a whole lot about sporting culture. I'll leave that to others. I'm going to set a timer here so I'm not hopelessly long. And I want to start, though, with a couple of props. And I can see already that I'm going to have an issue with my slides. So I'm going to start with my props. And, you know, so one must wave a flag, especially at festivals. And, of course, the festival spirit was really defined by lots of bunting and lots of vinyl. So we want to put this down. And I also, you know, if I had been at the Coliseum for the opening ceremony with some 93,000 others on July 28th, 1984, I would have reached under my chair for this welcome bag for seat 8, row 18, section 6, to read this. Hold on a second while I open. And you know, I could have gone to these games if I'd had a seat, but of course I stayed away because everyone said the traffic was going to be terrible. So I didn't go anywhere. And it was the first Carmageddon. It was fine. So it says, welcome to the Olympics. During the opening ceremonies, you will take part in a spectacular card stunt. This will take place halfway into the ceremonies, just prior to the entrance of the athletes. Inside this bag is a plastic card in a color specifically assigned to your seat. Please do not exchange it with your neighbor! Exclamation point. Further instructions are inside, printed on your card. There were a lot of air quotes in those instructionals. So I have a lovely informational graphic here that will tell me something, but I thought perhaps that to introduce you with the opening ceremony, and I'll play a clip in a second, which features this massive, rooted in the ground, scaffolded, vinyl-adorned structure of the Olympics, to just give you a little sense of why the Olympics came to L.A. when others didn't want it after 1972 terrorism in Munich, 1976 and 1980 cost overruns with lots of architectural construction, and then a boycott, you know, an annoying boycott there by the U.S. of Moscow, and then you know, we become ultimately the only ones left standing to host the game ultimately. A story I won't really get into all so much because I've just got way too much to do in this, which I will explain in a moment. Okay. Oh wait, that didn't work. Oh, because I have to use this. Okay, I'm going to speak over this because we would hear 5, 4, 2, 1, all set for the biggest piece of public participation in human history, one TV commentator narrated. If it works, because you see, it could never be rehearsed. And in the stadium, I would have been told to lift my card. I'm doing it. And look at that stunning effect. Cards from all nations were lifted, representing the 140 nations that participated, barring the Soviet Union and some other Eastern Bloc countries. And you can see here also the lighting of the torch, and we'll see right there this novel effect that we'll see if it can be replicated in wooden buildings in the future. And there we go, we see the lighting. And now something very strange that will also bring us all together in awe of the spectacle, coming up in just a second here. Oh my Lord, what could that be flying through the air? That is Rocket Man. Literally, he's called Rocket Man. And Rocket Man was part of an incredible mediated, corporately sponsored Olympics, the most to date, that had complete TV and radio coverage. And here we go, we had a few things going on, not only killing the environment there, lots of plastic going into the air, but they're color-coded streamers at the bottom of all of them. And what we actually have experienced here is a stage set, as the entire Olympics have been designed to be. We've seen it in a screen, right, like a movie screen or a TV screen, and they claimed that several billion people were watching on such screens from the comfort of their living rooms, and perhaps that's true. And what they saw were of course all of these different things that were very self-consciously about social engagement, right? Why were we all putting this up here? Why was there someone who worked in a supermarket singing a song and asking us to, thank you, and asking us to then reach out and hold hands with someone else. There was something going on in this self-conscious social engagement that here we were, 140 countries, a public body, even those who were, wrapped up into it from their living rooms. All of this against a backdrop of late Cold War geopolitics that seemingly were belied by these designed efforts not to deploy symbols or colors of state power. So the colors you see here, and I understand I have to keep doing this, right? And that you see here, these color codings are the antithesis of that. And I'm continuing to have here we go, sorry. And so one of the things that we start to see is that though there might be a seeming apolitical nature to the color scheme, right, that Deborah Sussman, who was asked with her firm Sussman Praja and John Jurdy partnerships to create the look of the Olympics, which she called very cryptically, I think, but sounds really nice, festive federalism. Right? And I think festive is key here, right? That this is what we're going for, is this sort of sense of what that two-dimensional celebration might look like for an Olympics that was in, a pretty stark contrast to the 1932 examples of solidity and classical stature, right? Here, what we started to get instead was ephemerality was surface. Rather than depth, and also endless reproducibility. All of that trumping this notion that we had to have a rootedness and an infrastructural skeleton that would be defining the city and the Olympics in 1984. So arguably, one of the efforts was to knit together the reuse of existing sports stadiums by a look to keep the games, according to their description, as a Spartan Olympics, a term that stuck for its no-cost to taxpayers approach to the games, run in a very prudent, business-like fashion. It was headed up, the president of the organizing committee, by Peter Ueberroth, a businessman in his own rights, who very, very savvily was able to sell TV rights for $225 million, radio rights for about $500,000, and had chosen with the committee to use existing sports stadiums. Only two facilities were built. Both were corporate sponsored, so it wasn't part of their dime. They recycled UCLA and USC dorms as Olympic villages, had AT&T sponsor things like the Olympic torch for $11 million. So they made money. They didn't have overbuilding. They had a surplus, in fact, which we can hear about it. It was a commercially funded model that didn't take public or federal monies. However, the charge at hand for all involved was to try and create an appearance for Los Angeles to enter a world stage as a place known for its geographical sprawl and also seen as sort of the second cousin at best to New York as an urban or world city, right? And so part of the charge was to try to knit together the different parts of the city. You see where some of the stadiums are. And to do so by fabricating a veneer or a facade or a look that would bring all of these disparate places together. And so John Jurdy and Deborah Sussman, together with a team that ended up being almost 600 designers, all set up shop in order to come up with this sort of kit of movable pieces that would be reconfigured in different sites in order to both festoon the existing venues and stadiums and dormitories, and to also try to knit them together so that there was an appearance of them all, again, fitting together. It is similar to here, where you can kind of see a number of elements. All of this came together to ultimately, I'm sorry, I knew this was going to be a problem. I was trying to have them all scroll, but I don't speak quickly enough for that. So in the end, Peter Ueberroth made a lot of money for the LA Olympics. And he made this a turning point, not just for a city that hadn't been really understood prior to this point, but for turning Olympics into a profitable enterprise. He also fortified an idea in many ways that privatization was a way to go, and it fit with the era of Reagan, of the Bradley years, and it came just at the same moment when Los Angeles itself had been experiencing massive deindustrialization and loss of jobs, as in the space of 5 years before the Olympics, some 75% of big industry, Firestone, all of these different companies, left town, leaving people without. So Mayor Bradley pitched his sort of coins on the idea of a global marketplace, investment that would come in, which we've seen the results of in many different ways, which I'll get to in a minute. Deborah Sussman and John Geraghty were among the designers who almost really their own histories spanned the legacies of 1950s through 1980s Los Angeles. We can see here that the color palette that Deborah Sussman came up with was a robust one that was also coming out of almost a handcrafted aesthetic, an Eamesian office aesthetic of moving around different elements of craft. Many of the designers who worked on this actually came out of that office, the Eames office. You could see also that one of her efforts was to try to capture the Mediterranean flavor of colors, in quotes, a Mexican marketplace, a Day of the Dead celebration, all of the countries along the Pacific Rim, but of course, through the idea of a scrim that would borrow from that color, not necessarily a full cultural appropriation, or even moving into those neighborhoods of the city that had that robustness on their own. So instead, we knit the city together with these moving parts that were ephemeral, that were banners, that were also read for the TV screen. When you saw gymnasts, you saw these colorful banners, again, a festival. You saw this backdrop intended for television and endless reproducibility. You saw runners going past that design look. And you saw created spaces, like here with these different arts venues that were set up to house a really robust arts program that I can't make stop. And that also served to lead us from one site to the other, to try and give us the sense of this city as a place of connection, not necessarily with one center, but centered through these overdrawn graphics. Super graphics was the term that Deborah Sussman had helped to give visual appearance to. And so when visitors and viewers experienced these games, they had a sense that in fact something had been constructed, that this look was creating a sense of place, even if that place wasn't indigenous to the location, right? So we had a facade of cardboard, of bunting, of nylon, a dressing up of these existing facilities that spread over 300 square miles, all revitalized with a flair, right? So this image connected the parts. And it became quite adaptable and a comprehensive program that ultimately gave a definition to a kind of graphic appropriation of public space that would follow. So when we start to think about some of the longer-term ramifications of the 1984 Olympics, we can think about both formalizing the look of a postmodern L.A. and the role of graphics as projecting into space and onto screens, right, as inseparable from architecture, from urban design, from landscape, lighting, and that very experience of the urban environment. So when we look at certain images like this one, it may ring a little bit too true of some of the malls that freeways that we drive down, where we see those guys all folding in their blown up space, and we see the advertising and the graphics sort of taking over our public view, right, so that we're colonizing public space even while marking private space. So in a way, we might think about this as also paving the way for a larger sense of creating public attendance through the privatization of genuinely public space that ends up being, far more about creating cohesion through the look of something that otherwise is really about commerce. All right, so we just want to think about what paths we might be paving. The Arts Festival was one of those dramatic turning points of this moment, where we saw not just the first presentations of performances that brought the avant-garde to the center in Los Angeles, like Sankaijuku. You see them off of the Dorothy Chandler in a free performance, over 400 performances throughout the city. That's what some of the signage in the previous slides was showing. And that was important for Los Angeles, who had its own art scene that didn't necessarily get the legitimacy. So with the Arts Festival, we were putting on this world stage, not just Los Angeles, but the idea of a global city, for both good and for bad. Murals became one of the ways in which we might see the voice of the people, through the folklore of the freeway, as Eric Avila discusses it, in which the very people who were displaced by the freeways that allowed the city to host the Olympics in all of these repurposed venues, those very freeways had in fact really cut across so many different neighborhoods of color. And so in a way, murals became sort of the promenade, a false promenade of Olympia, right, towards Olympia. Only here, these people who were representing a variety of perspectives of the marginalized were themselves marginalized in their murals and underpasses and freeway embankments. And so when we think about this moment of 1984, we want to think about the ways in which Los Angeles in '84 served a bunch of different functions that I'm not going to get into because my slides keep moving too quickly, but that also sort of highlight the ways in which the Coliseum served as both a publicly reproducible image and the ways in which it became ingrained in many people's memories at a moment in Los Angeles history where, as I think we'll continue to have the discussion, the public was comprised of a very diverse array of people, not all of whom would necessarily benefit through the privatization that this was a hallmark of, but many of whom would benefit from the surplus gains of the Olympics in this moment. I have one rest in peace slide of Deborah Sussman here, who inspired this examination and who passed on the anniversary of the Olympic Games in 2014. So it seems a fitting conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. I don't know if you want to leave your props up here, or we can collect them when it's time for the panel discussion. We're now going to zoom ahead once again to imagine Los Angeles in 2024. And we're very pleased that Bill Hanway is here to help us do that. Bill's an executive vice president and the leader for global sports at AECOM, the design, infrastructure, and construction services firm. His work focuses on large-scale regeneration projects and major sports events master planning. He led the AECOM team that delivered the Rio 2016 Olympic and Legacy Master Plan. We're all going to see that on our television screens this summer, as well as the conceptual design for all of the venues on the main Olympic Park. Previously, he was responsible for the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games and Legacy Master Plan. He currently leads the AECOM team advising on the Tokyo 2020 Games. So as you can see, he's all over the world at the moment, and the Los Angeles bid, importantly for our discussion tonight, for the 2024 Games. Other recent projects include the new arena for the Sacramento Kings, which is just about done, right? New campus extension for Cambridge University, and the Heart of Doha Master Plan in Qatar. He also authored the master plan for the King's Waterfront in Liverpool, a UNESCO designated World Heritage Site. So to tell us about LA and 2024, Bill Hanway, thank you for joining us.
I will also set the timer, and I've been taking notes, so I'm going to do a little more research on colored vinyl before I move any further down the planning process that we're going through. We are in the very, very early stages of this process. We are 9 years away. We have to first win the bid, which is going to be decided in Lima, Peru in September of 2017. It'll be a big moment. We're very confident that we have a great bid, but we're also bidding against 3 European cities of well-known, Paris, Rome, and Budapest. So it's going to be a very difficult competition, but one that we feel very strongly about the impact of LA. Now, Chris just mentioned some of my background in terms of working on Olympic Games, but I think it's also important that we heard a little bit about the criticism of games too, and there is a substantial amount of money that is leveraged into producing an Olympic Games, an Olympic event. And if you look at the sum of money over a course of a 16-day period, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all, and it never did for us. I got into this because I was asked by the mayor of London to see, is there a way of leveraging the value and financial impact of a games to actually solve some of the city's larger problems? And that started to drive a way of thinking about the games that has continued in our efforts both in Rio and Tokyo and now in Los Angeles. But I also think that in every single games that has been held, there's something important to learn, both positive and negative. The whole concept of legacy drivers for games really came to light in Barcelona, and how the mayor looked at what he could do to prepare the city. We've seen great things happen in Los Angeles. We know that there have been challenges in Athens, but all this feeds into a process that I think influences how we want to deliver the games for London. Now, London was a large 700-acre site, an industrial wasteland in the East End of London, historically one of the poorest parts of London. Mayor Livingston said that he could never find a way of solving the problem because there was not enough political will to force substantial change there. But the Olympics provided that impetus. And there are lessons here learned. You can see running down the middle of that channel is the Lee River, canalized like the L.A. River is. And one of the things we wanted to do was to redeliver a new park in that area, but also to release the river from its constraints and create natural wetlands. And all of this became a driver. Now, when you have a successful games, you get to rewrite history, but it wasn't always that strong. You can see in that upper right-hand corner, we had some very inventive people that were running sort of questionable businesses on the site. I was always impressed that they made the effort to paint the tires, the rings of the Olympic rings, but then sort of sad that they started spelling the words wrong in that first effort before someone came in and painted the right ones on the top in white. So, it's always a challenge. What was also on the site was the world's largest refrigerator island, just leaking fluids into the water. And so when you're challenged with these things, you can say, well, these are a process of recovery and regeneration. And so how do we do that? So every time we drew the Olympic plan, which is on your left, we drew a transition plan between the period of when you can have full development and post-games, and then what is the legacy plan. So what that allowed us to do is every time we put in infrastructure, we put it in based around the location of the ultimate legacy plan. When we developed the legacy plan, we looked at what was in the deprivation index, where the hospitals had to be, where the secondary and primary schools had to be, and that crafted the solution for the Olympics. So no move was made on the Olympic plan that didn't have some sort of positive benefit in the legacy. Now, it was never completely perfect, and plans change, but if you go there now, it actually looks very close to the way that we thought about it. We constantly see success running through the project. So we do have, this is the Lee River during the course of the games, and it's been removed from its canalized state. There are no concrete barriers, and now the park is now flourishing. And what this allowed us to do was to think about Beijing, where the icon of Beijing was a bird net stadium, and it's now going into disrepair and has challenges that were mentioned before. What we wanted to do was to deliver the Olympic Park as the icon, because the park drives success across wider communities. And this is what we were able to establish, and is now grown into a place which is relatively beloved by all in London. Also had a chance to work in Rio. Rio is arguably one of the most beautiful cities in the world, a place where I love going to visit, but as powerful as it's beautiful, it also has huge social challenges that we all know about. In the middle of delivering the London Olympics, we had 2008, and we had to find a way of solving those problems. When you think back in 2009, when Rio won the games, they were an ascending economy. They were moving up the GDP global ladder. They were about to overtake the UK in terms of their position. And then 5 years later, we see a complete collapse of the economy in many ways. And so how does an Olympic Games or World Cup make sense within that context? And it's very hard. But once the process is started, you have to find ways of delivering games that also adds to long-term value for the city and the country and the community. So in this process, we started 2 years after the games had been won, and we had to build a master plan very quickly. But we established that process of games transformation and legacy, constantly looking at what the impact of the process was to ensure that there was a legacy that could be delivered. And that included the same sort of social infrastructure that we looked at in London. We also had to find a way of looking at the next steps. I think the biggest sort of tragedy in Athens is you go back and look at some of those sporting venues, and they're abandoned and unused now. And we didn't want to be put in that position, and certainly the mayor of Rio said, we will not be in that position again. So if we were building temporary venues, I just don't want them to be like the building that we delivered in London for basketball, which was a temporary venue, can be removed, then has to really sort of be reused in its entire state as a large tent or a basketball. He said, I want you to find a way of designing facilities that are in modular component parts that can be taken apart and then delivered in other ways. And so we were able to look at the handball facility, look at the modular components, and now have been able to we'll be able to turn that into 4 new schools in and around Rio. So what is the impact of the challenge of games, and how do you find solutions that are constantly evolving? And just in case anybody's worried, it is getting built. There will be some challenges, but I think the pride of the Brazilian people, it'll be a great party, and we will have an Olympic Games there. So this takes us to L.A. How does L.A. differentiate ourselves? And I think Christopher's introduction around this being the sort of third stage of development for Los Angeles is very important. When you talk about Los Angeles, and I'm from New York, I'm another East Coaster, but live in London for the last 20 years, you kind of think of the easy answers, you know, the sunshine, the beach, the traffic, but there's another whole side of LA that really needs to drive the success of our bid, and that's everything to do with the concepts of creativity and innovation that are embedded here in the city itself. We saw that evidenced in 1984, we saw that evidenced in 1932, but it's even more important now. And the idea of the youthful energy that drives this city, and really looking at some of the challenges that are going on in the Olympic movement, with all the major sports governing bodies being challenged right now under many, many different, you know, bribery, drugs problems. This could be an opportunity to evolve the IOC brand and turn it into something incredibly powerful for the future, and I think LA has that possibility. This is sort of the basis, you know, the starting point for the Third LA. There's a huge amount of investment already going into the city itself, but where it's important for our bid is that it's not going to be publicly funded. It's entirely privately funded games, and so we're not going to be in a position because we can take advantage of the money that's already going into the city. We can also look at the arts and culture that happened in 1984, 1932, and start to evolve a cultural plan and a cultural Olympiad. We already have 800 museums and galleries in the city, ever expanding, and it's a powerful change in how LA has to be viewed in the world. We also have $88 billion in public transportation being invested. That's not associated with the Olympics, but can the Olympics expedite, facilitate additional changes to the metro lines and get those done faster? I think that's one thing that we can work at. So it's a different type of legacy than we saw in London and possibly in Rio. This is a different story, but another powerful one. We've seen the restoration of the LA River as a starting point. We certainly want to work and continue that effort to transform the sort of more concrete parts. And the revitalization of downtown LA is a fantastic part of the story and the transformation of the city itself. So how does that translate into a plan into a modern games? And what I loved about the maps that were shown for 1932 and 84, a lot of those principles and a couple of those locations are still embedded. But for us, the idea of creating significant clusters that allows us to look at efficiency in terms of delivering games, being able to use existing venues, and really we're only building one new venue, which is the Whitewater rafting course, which we'll put in Sepulveda, which has a great legacy use to it anyway. But all the other ones are either existing or temporary reuses and temporary reuses. So starting at the top left, we have the Valley Cluster. In 1984, no one in the Valley wanted to have the games. This year, the LMU study had 88% across the city for positive support for the games. The Valley was the only one that came in at 87%. So we think that in general, they're pretty positive about how we want to use the park. The one just below that is called the Coastal Cluster, and that's definitely a sort of PR nomenclature because it extends from UCLA down in Santa Monica. So yeah, we're calling it Coastal Cluster, and everybody in LA has to repeat that and say, oh yeah, of course it's part of the coast. But UCLA obviously is important because one of the biggest costs of any Olympic Games is the Olympic Village. In London, it cost almost $3 billion, and although it turns into a private sector and sold back to the private sector, it's still a huge amount of money to use as capital investment, and half of that was spent by the public sector. So by using UCLA, we have a great opportunity to actually use something that was used in 1984 and reuse it again. Now, there's an inherent bias in the IOC about using dormitories, and that leads back to when I was in school, where you got a box and maybe a metal bed as your comforts in a dorm. But now, walking through UCLA, we took the president of the IOC through UCLA, and instead of getting in golf carts, he decided to walk the whole campus, and it was one of the best things we've ever seen, and he loved it. And so we've sort of overcome that prejudice. Working further down south, we are using the StubHub cluster with for tennis and rugby. But importantly, we have the downtown cluster, which really spans from Expo Park, using the Coliseum, of course, again, the future L.A. Football Club, extending up Figueroa to the Staples, L.A. Live, using Staples Center, the Convention Center, and Microsoft. So this becomes an important part of reestablishing the importance of downtown L.A. And in the Paralympic Games, which is an important part of the delivery of the games, every time we are having Olympic sport in a venue, the parallel sport for the Paralympics will be held in the same venue. And it's important too, and it's become a very, very positive part of the overall Olympic delivery. So this map is also important in terms of identifying the Third L.A. On your left is a 1984 map identifying all the public transport available at that time. The map on the right is this is where we are now. I mean, it is a fantastic transformation in any city, the greatest in the U.S. and one of the greatest transformations of public transport from around the world. So once again, no private cars will be driving to any of our venues. It will be all done on public transport. And so once again, Carmageddon will not occur, and we will be able to handle that very, very well. So these are just some pretty pictures of the locations, but using UCLA campus, just transforming the way people think about the city. We have two of the top 25 academic institutions in the world. You look at Occidental, you look at LMU. It is a fantastic place for academic achievement. We are going to play beach volleyball on the home of beach volleyball, which hard to argue that point, but it'll be a temporary facility for 15,000 fans watching the games and watching the sunset. Griffith Park, 1932 games. We're going back there. We're turning Wilson Golf Course into a world-class Torrey Pines golf course, but remaining a public venue so that it becomes one of our legacy gifts back to the city. We're looking at the Coliseum. You mentioned what could possibly transform here. This is, USC is going to invest somewhere around $270 million to transform the Coliseum. The architects are retaining the entire single bowl structure and essentially inserting this 10-story building into the south stands in order to get the type of amenities necessary to hold new games and to obviously host the Rams playing here. What has happened is the change in the field of play where you can't get an athletic stadium. And so what we have to design is up to about the 13th row of stands, a temporary platform with all the support services underneath and the athletics track on top. So we will take away the temporary stands at the end, rebuild into stands at the peristyle end, and it comes back to some of the pictures that you saw originating in 1932. L.A. Football Club will deliver their new facility, and we're hosting the aquatics in there by putting in a temporary swimming pool in there. It's something that we can do very readily, and it becomes, a great part of the Expo Park delivery. We have L.A. Live. We know the history and power of that location. Not surprising, we're holding basketball prelims and finals in Staples. Thomas Bach was given when he visited, Kobe Bryant gave him a number 24 jersey, his jersey, to Thomas Bach. It's a classic moment. And this is where some of the great LA design community has to come in and have an impact on the games. So connecting Expo Park all the way up to LA Live, we want to try and transform Figueroa. So the mayor is putting in bike lanes there, but is there a way of turning what should be one of the greatest streets in America into something that we can all be proud of? And we are looking at how do you introduce innovation, how do you create a secure corridor, but then what happens to it after the games, and what do we want to see transform on that street? So these are some of the things that we want to work with the design community on in terms of delivering and developing strong ideas. One of the most expensive buildings that you can build during Olympic Games is the International Broadcasting Center, which is about 1 million square feet that is one of the things I'm beaten on a regular basis every time I go to Rio for what they see as a difficult challenge of building something that expensive. The biggest user of the International Broadcasting Center is NBC, who produces the games. And so NBC Universal has agreed to let us look at the opportunity to build the sound stages on their property, which would once again be a great legacy where we're not having to build something that is not going to be used in the future. And then only in Los Angeles do you get a $2 billion stadium dropped in your lap in the middle of your bid process. So, this is going to be a great opportunity to look at the changes that come out of Rio. Sports change. We now have a venue like this which we can throw into the mix to find the best use for, and it's a luxury that we have. I'm going to show next a quick video. I'm sure some of you have seen it, but it also reflects on the creativity that is embedded in Los Angeles in terms of not just star power, but the ideas and technology that can be produced for games. And I will leave you with this before we go into it.
Wow, 2024. So when do we got 8 years?
Well, I'll be
2024, I'm going to be doing what I love.
Doing some pretty weird stuff.
In 2024, I'll be right here in the City of Angels, watching the Olympics.
I'm going to be welcoming people to the city I love.
LA is a city that it buzzes all the time.
Every single day feels like anything could happen.
In 2024, I'm going to be competing with some of the best athletes in the world.
At 2024, I'll still be playing the drum. Sure I will.
I'm going to be winning gold in my backyard.
I'm going to be right here in downtown LA, doing it my way.
In 2024, we'll finally be in flying cars. And I know that for a fact.
In 2024, the Russian weightlifting team is going to be eating Korean tacos. That's what they're going to be eating.
Who will win the gold medal in 2024 in dressage?
In 2024, I want to win a gold.
In 2024, I'm going to be up on that podium.
2025, not as exciting, weirdly. 2024, your mind's gonna be blown.
I'm excited to see the next generation of athletes coming up in LA.
You're looking at two future Olympic athletes right here. In 2024, I'll be faster than anyone. 2024 gold, bronze.
The Olympics will be the incredible convergence of creativity and athletics.
LA, Olympics.
What's up, man?
Los Angeles is boundless. It's a place that's a reflection of the way the world looks today and what America will look like tomorrow.
And by 2024, we're going to be rolling.
Dun, 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 dun. You know.
All right, so I'm going to close with that, and thank you very much for your time.
Do a little housekeeping.
Oh, sorry. Wait, let me check my props. They're precious.
Okay, so we're going to bring up all of our panelists, and we have one face that's new to all of you, Renata Simrel, who's in the middle there, is the relatively newly appointed president and CEO of the LA84 Foundation. Before that was my colleague at the Los Angeles Times. Before that, senior vice president for external affairs for the Dodgers. Before that, deputy mayor for economic development for Mayor James Hahn. From 2002 to 2004. So, Renata, let's start with you. Just tell us, there may be many of you who are not familiar with the LA84 Foundation. What's the mission? What's the history of that organization? And what's the work that you do in that job now?
So let me ask a question first. How many people were here or born and enjoyed the 1984 Olympics? Okay, so better than average crowd. Kathy talked about the $215 million surplus that we enjoyed It actually went to 2 organizations. 40% of the surplus came to the L.A.84 Foundation, which was then known as the Amateur Athletic Foundation, and 60% went to the USOC as a foundation. Since that time, you know, it was interesting. I'm going to actually write a point. You said that looking at the design when you talked, is that a lot of the LA residents didn't benefit through the participation of the games, but do so through the legacy of the '84 Olympics, and that is us. We fund primarily youth sports in underserved communities to really expand participation to those communities that don't have an opportunity for whatever reason, either to buy equipment, to have structured sports program. We partner with the likes of LAUSD with Beyond the Bell, L.A.'s Best program, some that you might be familiar with. But we also fund some of Falcon Sports, you know, an incredible you know, individual and his wife that run a football program in a safe way that engages kids in sports participation. We've also you know, invested in infrastructure, actual facilities, about 100+ facilities we've invested in. The most notable is the restoration of the 1932 swim stadium and the building at Expo Park, the Rose Bowl Aquatic Center here around the way, and Ferraro Fields in Griffith Park, soccer fields, so that underserved communities, you know, have an opportunity to have facilities with which to, you know, engage sports activity. And so that is what our mission is. We've invested over $225 million over the 30 years. We've impacted more than 4 million kids, funded 2,100 nonprofit organizations, and we're just getting started. This is my 64th day, and we're you know, excited about the opportunity. You talked about being lucky and having a NFL sports team come back and build a $2 billion facility in Inglewood. I'm lucky in that Boston bowed out and L.A. is you know, engaged in the bid, and legacy is an important element of what we do. So what can the impact of an Olympic Games have on a community long after the 16 days are gone? We are, in essence, we've turned the 1984 Olympic torch into an eternal flame. And just 2 points to note, the legacy continues with involvement. Peter Uberoff is on our board, as is Rayford Johnson, the gentleman you saw running up the stairs to light the torch. They're both board members, and I just am delighted that I get to work with such an incredible organization and 2 incredible individuals who preserve the legacy of the Olympic ideals to impact communities that otherwise wouldn't have benefited.
And speaking of legacy, you're someone who understands the political culture of the city, having worked in government. You also understand the urban history, having worked in and studied urban planning. What's your sense of the legacy? What can 2024 do for Los Angeles if there's a 2024 foundation many decades in the future?
There won't. It be LA84 plus 24 equals legacy squared. So
but
the money's coming to us if there's a surplus.
Okay,
I'm just
so
putting
there's
that
only
out
one.
there.
That's already.
I'll note that down. So.
What should we be pushing for as Angelenos for this Olympics to do for the city if we win this bid?
In terms of the work that we do long after they're gone?
Right, in terms of how the city has changed and what the Olympics can do for the city for leveraging some of the changes that are already underway that Bill and others have talked about.
You know, it's interesting of why you know, LA seems to always come back to restoring the Olympic movement, 32, 84, and now with the possibility of 2024. And LA is very unique from a sport culture perspective. We were just shortlisted to be the sport business's ultimate sports city award. I don't know, we're third, one of 3. Right. And we have 9 professional sports teams, 8 Division I NCAA sports programs. We have more venues, arenas, and stadium than any other metropolitan area in the nation. We've hosted, as you know, 2 Olympics, 7 Super Bowls. There are 10,000 employees that work in sports across Los Angeles, and there are 18 million tickets sold on an annual basis. And so when you think about the Coliseum, USC, the Rams, the events that, you know, you talked about, when you talk about UCLA, USC, you know, I can go on, that there is an active sport culture here. We are, without question in my mind, the sport capital, not just of the United States, but the sports capital of the world. And for me, and the conversations that we're having with the legacy team at LA 2024, is how do you coalesce the ideals of the Olympic movement, teamwork, inclusion, diversity, excellence, and really have that impact communities that don't often benefit from that legacy. Many of the programs that we fund in LA Unified School District, just to give you a statistic, 75% are Latino. And there's about just under 700,000 kids in LA Unified School District. 75% Latino, 77% qualify for free or reduced lunch. And that's a note for poverty. And that's where we look to make the biggest impact. So I think the biggest thing that we can do is how do we promote the Olympic ideals? How do we take and leverage, hopefully, another successful Olympics that has a surplus, and then make sure that we're providing the infrastructure and the venues that have a long legacy, and that we're investing in those communities that are underserved. I mean, I think Bill talked about the Paralympic movement. There is a whole generation of mentally disabled, physically disabled kids that don't have an opportunity to participate in sports. So how can we take this moment and really elevate the work that we've done over the last 30 years and really continue to impact those communities in a meaningful way?
And if I could just make a comment on that,
Sure.
I think one of the things that we're looking at is how do you create sort of live sites, and how do you enhance awareness of other parts of LA that don't normally get the attention that you would have by having a Staples Center in the center of it. And the concept of live sites is to celebrate in a local park, putting up big screens, allowing the sort of sharing of the Olympic movement and highlighting a local community that would not necessarily have that advantage in the wider context of the games. The other ways that we want to try and establish awareness is through running marathon. We're not allowed to dictate where the marathon goes, but we can identify communities who would like to see the cycle and marathon races go through. So it's about not just celebrating everything that we have in LA already, celebrating the changes, but also I think celebrating identify areas for the future growth.
And a question for all of you, but let's start with Frank and Kathy to go back to one of the questions I raised at the beginning. To what extent should LA think of itself as exceptional in terms of the willingness or skepticism about hosting the Olympics? And Kathy really touched on the relationship between the design and its appeal being also part of its thinness, really, that it wasn't connected or embedded in the city itself. And I'm just wondering how both of you feel about, given that history, given the skepticism and the problems in other cities, what should be the kind of appropriate level of skepticism in Los Angeles in terms of 2024?
The skepticism is part of the history of LA political history and sport history. I mean, that part of the reason why they're able to go to the model they are in '84 is precisely not just the reluctance to pay for an Olympics in light of what happened in Montreal and Munich, but also to renovate the Coliseum for the Rams. There was no political will for a luxury box for the Rams in the mid-'70s in this country. So, I mean, in this city. So there was a real healthy skepticism. It's not by accident that California in general hasn't had a whole lot of new NFL or MLB stadiums. If you look at the older facilities in Major League Baseball and in the NFL are in California, San Diego, the Oakland Coliseum, right? And this Inglewood Stadium is a new phenomenon, it seems to me, which, given this history of skepticism about public financing for these sort of venues, I mean, I think that's part of the legacy that the city has, that clearly is part of the thinking of the planning of the future. But again, I think as you raised earlier, I mean, the big question as a value of 2024, it seems to me, is the question of accessibility. Accessibility to those venues during the games, after the games, accessibility in terms of jobs, in terms of, I mean, like, accessibility as a buzzword is something I'd like to hear more of when I think about the future of the Olympic movement in this country, because there is this history of in this city. There is this history of accessibility that I think we can build upon, it seems to me.
Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, I rather want to piggyback along those lines, and also to go back to what you introduced with a few words, right, like militarization and police harassment. So in '84, there was a huge homeless problem, and they weren't just elderly white men. It was a transformative, several years around the Olympics where mostly people of color and families, women and children, were on Skid Row. And here we are, a whole lot of time later. And I'm thinking back about the police sweeps of downtown in the weeks and the months all around the Olympics in '84, and where did homeless people retreat? Who's really their network was downtown streets. They went to the LA River, right? And so I feel like over this span of time, we haven't necessarily seen a solution to those problems. And it's too much for any Olympics or any one city agency or one political era even to solve those huge problems. It would be good to know how we'll be able to manage the kinds of temporary influx of people, whether it's through a marathon, which is rather like a ciclovia too, right? That it can enliven, but will it actually have an attendant effect besides displacement or removal?
And certainly there were stories around this year's Super Bowl in San Francisco of sweeps of getting large numbers of homeless people off the streets. And Bill, I won't ask you to address that question. We'll certainly talk about this next week in our homelessness panel. But I will ask you about the river. If there's been one change in the bid, it's been the decision to move the Olympic Village from consideration of using the piggyback yard site along the river, and then a decision to move over to UCLA. So my question for you is, what role does the river play now, given that that Olympic Village has been moved over to the UCLA campus?
Well, I'm going to try and tie in some of the observations that you guys have made in terms of what the Olympics can do against some of these larger problems. And no, you can't assume that the Olympics is going to solve everything, but what it does do, it does galvanize focus, and it does bring agencies together. And what I've seen in every games I've ever worked in is you get the federal, state, and city agencies all focusing in on a city or in a location to try and find a solution. It doesn't mean it automatically creates a solution, but it's usually the first time you can get that sort of multi-pronged alignment of agencies to look for a solution. So I think there's a possibility and change that can happen, and using the Olympics is certainly a great catalyst for that. In terms of the switch from the LA River, I show the London plan because I'm committed to some of those changes that can happen in the natural environment and the long-term positive impact those can see. We had to make a decision around that for a number of reasons, and it wasn't necessarily moving away from the idea of investing in the LA River, but it was more about the opportunities that UCLA gave us in terms of minimizing any risk to the public purse, and that became the priority in terms of the move away from really putting in a huge amount of money and risk in terms of development, and that was our major commitment. And of course, the quality of UCLA's campus and facilities makes that very easy. But it doesn't mean we're abandoning the LA River. LA River runs down the south of Sepulveda Basin, will become highlighted, and I think that any support that we can give to the Friends of the LA River and their approaches to how you make transformation, how you can piggyback that onto the Olympics, we're more than happy and willing to work on that. I think if you think about the piggyback yard site itself, there are challenges from operational sides for the railway, there are challenges from remediation, and certainly creating enough land value to do that. And that was some of the reasons why we moved away from it.
And one more question about 2024. One of the goals of the first Los Angeles and the 32 Olympics was really to establish, as we've talked about, a kind of public identity for the city. There was huge investment in public and institutional architecture. The 84 Olympics was in the middle of a city that was really rapidly privatizing, and the Olympics certainly reflected that. Now, if there's one thing that kind of ties together all the themes that define the third Los Angeles, is a kind of return to public space and an attempt to repair, revivify, reanimate the public sphere in a city that had really moved away from doing that. And one thing I think is missing from this kind of proposal at this point is some discussion of investment in the public realm. So certainly there's a lot of interest in reusing venues that are here, and that's done for obvious reasons, and there's a lot of appeal to that in terms of the economy of that approach. But in terms of the legacy, to what extent can the bid actually begin to tie back into the ways in which the city is reinvesting in the public sphere, as opposed to, let's say, the architecture of LA Live, which is very inward focused, or even the Inglewood Stadium, which has the potential, at least, of being a kind of island and not really connected to the rest of the city of Inglewood. To what extent can the bid begin to make direct investments in the public realm, public sphere here?
Well, I think it's hard to make direct investments unless they have an immediate impact, but what it can do is look at the way that people will be moving and connecting between the clusters as we've laid out in the future of the impact of public transportation on that. And those connective lines become opportunities to create not just additional housing or additional development, but also additional open space. And I think that dialogue has to happen. If you look at certain parts of LA, the amount of public open space is a challenge. and the opportunity to use this as leverage to start to open those conversations is certainly an important part of the dialogue. And as part of our sustainability strategy, we are developing that, and that'll become more part of our public presentations later on.
And Chris,
Go
if I
ahead.
could, and when you talk about
Sure.
legacy, not necessarily for the 16 days at the Olympics, you know, our grant strategy is Southern California, those communities that held an Olympic, that had an Olympic venue or held an Olympic sport, and that the legacy of that 100 plus investment in infrastructure project in many cases is public space. Active recreation for the most part, looking to do that through partnerships like baseball fields, soccer fields. So there are places where community can engage in large measure, highly underserved area, high crime ridden areas, you know, to really give people a safe place to recreate, to play, to engage in competitive sport activities. And so that's the legacy that we have endured over the last 30 years, and certainly in our conversation with 2024 bid and what can we do to elevate that is certainly part of the dialogue for that ongoing 30-plus year after the 2024 games.
And one difference, though, in terms of what can be leveraged, what kinds of changes, is the complicated political structure here, unlike China, of course, which could make a kind of command decision about what gets built and what gets built in advance of the Olympics. I wonder if you can describe the complexity of anticipating what might change between now and 2024. We have a new Measure R on the ballot in the fall, which might accelerate the construction of the Wilshire Boulevard subway line. But we don't have that kind of, I think mostly for better, we don't have that kind of government structure that can just make changes by fiat. So what is the relationship between your group bidding, thinking about the design, City of Los Angeles, federal government, in terms of what can happen between now and 2024? In other words, what can be ready before the Olympics open?
It's at the very premature stages of development of this. I mean, clearly most of our contact is with the city of Los Angeles through Mayor Garcetti, and then the other cities that we're working in, whether they're Santa Monica or others. And that's the primary discussion. We know that as we develop the plans, there'll be more influence with the state government and ultimately with the federal government in terms of the security side, and then how the investment is then leveraged into and delivered on the ground. So I think it's too early to start saying and understanding exactly how that is going to happen, and it will be complex, but we're happy to come back and talk about that more.
How does that compare, though, to London in terms of your experience there and bringing together a number of government authorities to make those kinds of changes? Think about the legacy. Does this strike you as a more complex political environment to work in?
As I carry both passports, I have to be very careful about which one gets taken away. But if you think about the size and scale of the UK, it's 65 million people. The GDP is about the same, and population is about the same as California. So in essence, you're comparing two very equivalent sized economic engines. I think the UK has a slight advantage in that it goes from city directly to federal decision-making processes. Here you have the state involvement, but I think that can also be an advantage.
Last question for you, and then we'll go ahead.
Just if I can,
Yeah.
you know, echo, and I see that you can't determine today, you know, what infrastructure projects will be accelerated. It's a complicated formula, but I can tell you from my observation in talking with Metro and talking with the airport and talking with the city and the county, to Bill's point earlier, and I think this happened in the '84 Olympics, is that there is a renewed focus around what is possible and using the Olympic bid as an opportunity to see what we can accelerate. So certainly Measure R, the infrastructure project that we talked about, but even on the issue of homelessness. I mean, you have for the first time the city and the county actually collaborating. You've got new appointment with Wendy Gruhl to LASA to bring the federal government in. And so there's really robust conversations going on on how we can leverage the focus on LA to really move forward and advance what's possible over the next 14 months and hopefully the next 9.5 years.
Last question, then we'll open up to a couple of questions from all of you. Bill, I want to ask about the relationship between the Inglewood Stadium and the Coliseum. Do you foresee one of them being opening ceremonies, the other being closing? Is it too soon to say that? And one of the reasons I ask is that we all know, having watched the Olympics, and certainly I thought about this a lot in terms of the buildings that become icons in the way that, given the way that the Olympics are televised these days, it is likely to be the case that one building will become kind of the representative piece of architecture that the rest of the city sees on all of the introductory sort of televised events. Do you see that being Inglewood? Do you see that being the Coliseum? Is there some way to do both?
That's a great question, because we only really have heard about the new stadium very recently. We haven't put that into our plan yet. It's certainly going to have a role in how we develop our long-term thinking. But as I said before, we get a lot of feedback post-Rio. There are sports that change post-Rio, and that will all have to feed into sort of a wider look at our current plan. So I am very confident that it'll play an important role. Which role that is, I don't know right now.
Fair enough. Okay, questions? We'll take a couple. Yes, over here.
Of course, and it's not just it's not only a requirement in the IOC, but obviously we're working closely with Mayor Garcetti's team with his Plan L.A. and developing within that construct how we can enhance and accelerate some of the goals. But we are talking about the first energy positive games ever, and we're working with some very, very great technology companies to deliver that.
One more question in the back, yes.
I will have to refer to my technical experts on that. But I would say that I think that L.A. will be surprisingly positive in terms of some of the locations that we've identified in terms of that. If you think about the valley, you think about Santa Monica Beach, and then you think about how that compares to the center of some of the other European cities. I think that although everybody complains about traffic and pollution, I think LA will perform quite well.
The geography of smog, though, is super interesting to think about in terms of where the venues go and how that plays out.
And I think that is really interesting also, because the way it will play out, if it's according to particulate matter, is that the sites will be in the places that are already clean and green, and not necessarily help to serve those that aren't, that kind of need the political will to be pushing towards
I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. Okay, so Bill, the announcement is next year. What date?
September in 2017. So
September of next year in Lima, Peru, correct? Lima, Peru. All right, we'll wait until then to reconvene this conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their presentations tonight. Thanks to all of you for being here, and we hope to see some of you next week here to talk about homelessness and the right to the city. Thanks so much. There are coffee